Our deep dives of every PWHL team continue. This time we're talking about Toronto and if they too can get over the playoff hump. All of that and more on the Women's Hockey Report, brought to you by the Locked On Podcast Network.
This is the Women's Hockey Report, presented by Locked On NHL. Your weekly look at the world of women's hockey. From the PWHL to the international stage, it's the Women's Hockey Report on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, women's hockey fans. Welcome to another Saturday morning where we get to talk about the PWHL and all things related to women's hockey. L Ayala alongside Rachel Donner. We are your co-hosts navigating this ship in the off season, and we are going team by team, doing deep dives, giving you what the teams have done in the off season, how they finished in season number 2 of the PWHL, and etc. So Toronto, it is your turn today. Rachel and I are going to do our deep dive. Before we get into that, I want to let you know today's episode brought to you by our good friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. How we're going to do this episode, Rachel, not so much for you, but for our listeners, is we're going to do our recap. What happened with Toronto last season? What did we see from them? What maybe was the downfall, especially as they were trying to make a push in the playoffs. Then we will talk players that either left in the expansion draft or free agency, and especially those that were added to the team. Then we'll give our outlook on the team before diving into some PWHL news. That's right. I hope you wiped the crust out of your eyes if you woke up Friday morning for the announcement. We'll get into that and so much more on today's episode. But thanks as always, especially for the every Saturdayers who listen to our episode every week. Again, part of the Locked On NHL channel. Rachel, let's it now. We've got all the business out of the way. Let's get down to it when it comes to Toronto, a team that we saw really soar to pretty significant heights in season 1. And then, I think a little bit of a mixed bag perhaps in season 2.
Yeah, it is interesting because you're looking at a team that did finish second overall in the regular season, right? So not a slouch here. They were a good team. They just weren't a great team. But where they really were able to take advantage of things were on the power play. They were the top of the league on the power play at 25.8%. Huge gap between them and the bottom of the league on that front. And, I don't think that, even though there was a lot of consternation and craziness at the end of the season, I don't think there was any doubt that they were going to make the playoffs solidly throughout the course of the regular season. And, they had a really strong lineup. It's just like the playoffs were a little bit tough on them.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that really just speaks to how there is parity in the PWHL. I think also sometimes the great equalizer becomes strategy, and we talked about it last week, right? When we talked about how Montreal fared versus the table with regard to what they did in the regular season, and then we talked about Ottawa and how they got a really hot goaltender at absolutely the right time, even though they weren't a team that was doing particularly well in the regular season. And of course, we talked about Minnesota. We started the series there, and we even had Kendall Coyne-Schofield and Lee Steckline on the podcast in the regular season to talk about it. It was a little bit of an up and down. So I think overall, before we again get back to Toronto, I just want to offer up that this is a league where your mistakes, so to speak, they get exposed, and maybe not right away, but eventually they do. And again, that's what allowed a team like both Minnesota and Ottawa, arguably, to even get into the playoffs, but definitely to get to that final. Okay, so you mentioned power play. There were some teams, again, that we talked about didn't have a great power play. Let's think about how they fared in the postseason in that first round. What do you think, again, just didn't particularly go in favor of Toronto and why they weren't able to advance?
Yeah, it's interesting because I go back and forth on, did Toronto lose this series or did Minnesota win this series,
Mhm.
right? And I feel like Minnesota put everything together at the right time, because even though Toronto did win the first game of the series, it was a close game. It was 3-2. And then, none of these games were low scoring battles. Like, both teams were scoring in this series. And especially when you looked at game 3 with a 7-5 score
Yeah.
in the end. So there was like a little bit of shaky goaltending on both sides. But I think ultimately Minnesota just turned on the Jets offensively and was able to do what they do best with those players. And Toronto couldn't keep up. I really think that's what it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're probably right there. A Minnesota team that I think really is a testament to, if you make the playoffs, anything could happen. Not so much the case again with Toronto. So when we look at what the team decided to do, knowing that they were going to lose players, could only protect 3, maybe an additional, depending how things went down, are you surprised at what Toronto opted to do here? I know we talked about it a little bit when we talked about Vancouver, wink wink. I should say Vancouver after the expansion draft, and some of the signings that they've had. But what did you make of, and I know we've talked about this before, but let's recap. What did you, Rachel, make of who they decided to protect and who they ultimately lost in the expansion draft?
I think they were spot on with their protection list. I think you look at Renata Fast, who maybe was my MVP of the whole dang season, right? But she definitely won Defender of the Year, as well she should have, in the season-ending awards. But she's number one on my list to protect. And then they went with Daryl Watts, who was their top scorer. Blayre Turnbull, who was part of that top line. I don't think they could have made any other choices there. They picked Emma Maltais for their fourth protection slot, which I think was the right move given who got taken already, right, and who was left to protect. So I think they did what they could. It's really interesting because based on the expansion free agency signings and the expansion draft, they lost a lot down the middle. And
Mhm.
that's real tough. That is real tough to come back from.
For sure, and we definitely will talk about that. You mentioned Renata Fast led the team 16 assists and contributed also with 6 goals. You mentioned Daryl Watts was just behind Fast when it came to assists, 15 assists, 12 goals overall. And then there was a player like Sarah Nurse. Now, on the one hand, I do think in the totality of the 2 seasons, Toronto asked a lot of Sarah Nurse, very much in the way that they asked a lot of Natalie Spooner, someone who did not get protected. However, we talked about that on a previous episode. Death taxes, Spooner in Toronto, I don't know. Kind of felt like that wasn't a move necessarily that if Spooner herself in particular had any say over as a young child. Didn't seem like everything that we knew about Spooner and her family that was necessarily something that she would entertain.
Right.
And again, Toronto, a healthy Spooner is a really good thing for this team. But with Sarah Nurse was someone that was made available and was picked up by Vancouver. What did you make of Sarah Nurse and her campaign in the last 2 seasons, or the first 2 seasons in the PWHL with Toronto?
Yeah, I found that she definitely played as though the entire weight of the team was on her shoulders. And I think it led to, some exhaustion, I would say. I think she made some mistakes that maybe she wouldn't have normally made because she was trying really hard to do everything for this team. I do think she had some spectacular moments, and I think there were some times where you could just tell she was gassed out there a lot. And I do think the change of scenery and a fresh start is going to be really good for her.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think that circumstances have been unkind to Sarah Nurse with when she came out of college and into what was a very tumultuous professional landscape for women's hockey. And so this is the first real time outside of international competition that we've gotten to see Sarah Nurse compete relatively close to night in and night out, right? In a competitive setting outside of the NCAA, because of course international competition is not a season. It's it's tournaments. So I agree with you. I think there were a lot of expectations. I think Sarah wore those expectations. And then with an injury to Natalie Spooner that we saw, that even amplified things more. To that end, maybe that's why Watts was a big acquisition for this Toronto club going into season 2. And I think you saw that Watts was able to take up the mantle in a different way. We just talked about points, overall assists, goals, than Nursey was able to do. So very curious to see what Sarah Nurse in particular is going to bring. Recently, I forget the outlet, so forgive me, but she spoke about the focus, even though she's going to an expansion team, or an expansion team in an Olympic year will still be the expansion team, and that she's really leaning into the PWHL. And I thought that was interesting. On the one hand, it's the thing you say, right? Because it is the surefire thing. We heard from Hillary Knight and Kayla Barnes that they're like, if I make the Olympic team, and we're all like, oh, yep, sure, if if you make it. And that's how I overall feel about Sarah Nurse. But I think for her, even though she will be at the August camps, we're going to get into that a little bit later for Hockey Canada, this is an opportunity that maybe also bodes well for her pitch to make an Olympic roster, is to really hunker down, focus on what she can do for PWHL Vancouver. But I don't think she's the only one. And so, Rachel, we're going to talk about what Toronto lost a little bit more in depth. We talked about it with regard to expansion, but let's really go, expansion, free agency, who's out the door, but also who they brought in. And we will close out again thinking about what is the prognosis, so to speak, for this team going into season 3, and wrap up with some news around the league and around the sport. That's all coming up on this episode of the Women's Hockey Report.
Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with friends or family? Maybe it's game day. You suddenly realize you want to be in the stands. That's exactly where Game Time comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, t-shirts, or even invite a bigger group to come with you. Game Time makes it possible. Game Time makes buying tickets fast and simple, and prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch. They've got incredible last-minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. Game Time is the official ticketing partner of Locked On MLB. It makes it easy to browse the app for an exciting upcoming game. My Phillies are on the road right now, but they're back at Citizens Bank Park on August 18th versus the Seattle Mariners. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem with the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
Welcome again to the Women's Hockey Report, brought to you every Saturday on the Locked On NHL channel, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thank you again for those every Saturdayers who join us every episode. Rachel, I don't know if you saw, but you caught a few strays in the comments with regard to,
yeah?
were we being too hard on Anne-Renee Desbiens? Was there hate coming her way? I don't think it was hate. It was definitely a tough decision made, but we could see that we had some Montreal fans there, and I love it. Broke down the stats and everything, shouting out the Ice Garden in an awesome article that they did. No, it was definitely not Anne-Renee Desbiens hate, although
Listen, I would have her as my netminder any day of the week, any day. I'm just saying, there was a lightning in the bottle season by somebody else that maybe deserved to be rewarded. That's all.
That fair enough. And I guess, as they say, well, they say in basketball, ball don't lie. So maybe puck don't lie
Puck
either.
don't lie. Yep. That is a
Puck
thing.
don't lie. Puck don't lie either. So, we'll see. We'll see who gets, the last I told you so. But or will someone else emerge? And maybe that's where Toronto, I think, has the most upside when it comes to netminders. And are they going to get maybe the lightning in the bottle goaltender for them this season?
Well, I think that's an interesting part of their offseason, right? Because they traded Kristen Campbell around the draft to Vancouver. They got a couple of draft picks in return. And I think, what they ultimately decided to do was go with Reagan Kirk, who performed very well for them this past season. She got about 10 games in and played very, very well. And then also brought in Elaine Chuli, and I think it's going to be really good competition between the two of them. I think they're going to start with Reagan Kirk as their starting goaltender, but I mean, we could be looking at a 1A, 1B situation here, or even something similar to what the Frost have when all is said and done.
Yeah, and we have debated this on a few episodes of the Women's Hockey Report. Is that more equitable split going to benefit if other teams do that? Because we only have one franchise that has won a Walter Cup. They have two of them,
Mm-hmm.
and that is Minnesota. And they are they are the franchise with two tried and tested Olympians in net.
Yeah.
So, and also, Olympians that happen to, compete for USA Hockey. So is it that they are Olympians? Is it that they're tested at the international level? Is it that they, know each other's tendencies and can kind of riff off of one another when that comes to training or what they're able to do on the ice? I mean, there are a lot of different things, but I think it's fair to say, Rachel, and we've been saying it, that it's noticeable that the relationship and the usage of the goaltenders in Minnesota is very different than what we've seen, even for an Anne-Renee Desbiens, and even for at times this Toronto team. I think that they have had to go to different goaltenders because of circumstance, right? Injuries, things of
Mm-hmm.
that nature. But perhaps if they can stay healthy, this is something that will work in their favor. As we're talking about netminders, we know that they also, of course, lost Carly Jackson, who will be in with PWHL Seattle. But let's talk about some other players. We got into it a little bit with Nursey, but not the only player that has changed zip codes. Do they do zip codes in Canada? I don't know.
Postal codes.
Postal code. There you go. Zip code, postal code, area code. Who knows? Some kind of code. They have changed teams. I probably should have just started with that, Rachel. So, who else? We've talked about Nursey. We talked about Jackson and Campbell. But who are some other players that you think could be potentially a big loss that has to be filled with some of the other moves Toronto made in the offseason?
Yeah, it's interesting. I did mention that they lost, a lot down the middle. So starting with Sarah Nurse, but then Hannah Miller, Julia Gosling going elsewhere. So Blayre Turnbull of their last lineup is the only center that they had remaining on the team. Now there's some other players who can play center who generally play wing, but in addition to that, on the forward side, they lost Izzy Daniel and Haley Skamura. I think were two important parts of that team. What they did very well is kept their blue line together. They only lost Megan Carter of their starting six defenders that they had in their last lineup in the PWHL playoffs. So obviously they protected Renata Fast. Savannah Harmon is still around. Kaylee Flanagan is still around. Allie Monroe is still around. Like that top four, even if they don't end up being, especially Allie Monroe and Kaylee Flanagan could end up dropping to the third pairing. Savannah Harmon may end up dropping to the second pairing, depending on how they put things together this upcoming season. But like to keep like your top four defenders is really good for them.
Yeah, I was just taking a look at the stats as well, and on the one hand, you think about, yes, you keep some of your core together. overwhelmingly that can bode well for a team, that consistency, continuity, etc. And what do you make of this Toronto team? And we might get into this as we talk about other elements of the offseason, but was what they were getting, were the contributions on the blue line at times enough to keep their goaltending out of hot water and under siege by some of the other attacking forwards throughout the league?
Right. And that's what's interesting because, I mean, we can sort of transition to the draft here because they were so focused on rebuilding down the middle that, even, they picked only one defender in the draft that I think has a shot of making the team in Hannah Baskin. But even then, I don't know if she's going to be in that top 6 to start the season. Like, there's not going to be much different on the blue line that we're going to see more defensive contributions on the score sheet. Right now, could they change the system based on who they have in order to make that work? Possibly.
Yeah, and if you look at, they had goals against, when we look at the regular season, they had the second fewest behind Montreal. So on the one hand, you look at that and you're like, okay, maybe that's good. But what we also see is they were more middle of the pack when it came to goals for. And the reason I mentioned the blue line in particular, and I know we talked about this. First of all, pause for the cause. We are not at the New York Sirens yet, but I don't know if you can hear the fantastic little musical interlude I'm getting here now.
Literal New York Sirens.
Literal New York Sirens. It's busy here in Brooklyn. So, New York Sirens, we'll get to you later in our series. But, and apologies for the noise. I'll do my best to mute while Rachel is talking. But, we talked about positionless hockey, right, on our last episode. And the reason I mentioned the blue line, and again, goals for not really all that bad, or excuse me, goals against not all that bad. But when you think of what they can do on the attack, is this an area where you want to see not just Fast, but some of these other returning blue liners be able to hop up or at least just help keep the puck in the zone a little bit more? Do you think that being able to reset and retool for Toronto could be something that perhaps will get them the results that they want a little earlier in the season?
I mean, I ultimately don't think it matters in the grand scheme of things if the system lends itself to the forwards getting the points. If defenders are getting all the assists on the planet, that's fine by me if that's what the system is. And we talked about how strong their power play was. That was part of that system, right? So I think that it really, you just want to look for success and you want to look for scoring. How they get there, I'm less worried about goals from defenders in the grand scheme of things here.
That's fair. Yeah. And I don't think necessarily goals, but there are, I think as positionless hockey kind of takes way throughout all levels of hockey, I think there are women's hockey players that are more suited for that role. And we've talked about a few of them when we talked about some of the other moves. And then there are still your stay at home defenders. I think, just to give an example, I think Lee Steckline is part of the surge that helped Minnesota get to the postseason, was that Lee Steckline started finding her way on the score sheet, specifically with goals for a stretch there. And it did make an impact. And at a time where, there wasn't perhaps enough offense. So, all right, let's continue on here. We mentioned the returners in a few different ways. We talked about Turnbull. We talked about Spooner and Watts. Maltais, Comfort, and Woods, as far as on the front end. Let's talk a little bit about them. All have re-upped, if you will, with Toronto.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's going to be really good for Toronto coming up is that they've kept together their top line of Turnbull with Watts and Jesse Comfer. I think Emma Gentry, draft pick. Now, they haven't signed their draft picks yet, so, we'll see when that happens. But probably while we're recording or after we're recording today, because that's how things go for us. But Emma Maltais and Natalie Spooner on the wings on that second line with a newcomer like Emma Gentry, that could work out really well for them. I think overall in kind of reconstructing this top six for the Sceptres.
Yeah, every time now I hear Emma Maltais' name, I think of that skit, "I have one daughter." That trend going around. It's like this guy who reenacts, I don't know, what some, like, dating app, you know, exchanges or whatever,
Yeah.
and there's this whole one where someone was asking, like, "Do you have any kids?" The person's like, "I have one daughter," and it's like, "But are they by the same father?" And the person's like, "I have one
One.
one daughter." And she did a little, parody of that being like, "So how do you make your money?" She's like, "I'm a professional hockey player." It was so good. Maltais.
Listen, as long as she's not dressing up as Alexander Hamilton and climbing out a window next.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I feel like the interwebs, but Monte, a good follow. And
Yes.
someone who I think we'll get to this probably a little bit later in the episode, but someone I definitely have circled for next season. I think, we've talked about the blue line and goaltending here. So, I think Rachel, the next thing to do is to talk a little bit more about free agency. There were some trades that Toronto was involved in. You alluded to that. And of course, we want to talk about the draft picks as we round out the picture of what this Toronto Sceptres team will look like and how they might perform come next season. We'll get into that on the other side of this break for the Women's Hockey Report. You have any kids? That's so funny. I just freaking love that. And it's going to be in my head all day. Okay, welcome back to the Women's Hockey Report. Take your eyes away from the scrolling Maltese social media, TikTok in particular, to talk about her team in Toronto. All right, so let's talk a little bit about a trade, and this does involve the aforementioned Sirens. No, not the ones outside of my hotel window, but the actual team in the PWHL. We saw a trade, Rachel, here. I'm curious to see how you think it will fare for the Sceptres.
Well, I did mention that there was a chance that Savannah Harmon would get bumped down to the second D pairing on this team. And that is because of that trade that brought Ella Shelton. And Ella Shelton on a pairing with Renata Fast, like, I mean, that is a quality move. And that gave them the luxury of being able to focus on their forwards in the draft. And I think that was so smart by Toronto to make that move.
Yeah, Ella, I mean, was one of the key players for that New York team, but just a New York team that we'll talk about. I have a lot of thoughts, but they just haven't been able to really find steady footing in the PWHL. They've made a few changes. They've already they're already on their second head coach. I just don't know if the vision of the front office was properly executed at times. I think that's why they made the original coaching change. And now it's kind of, they stumbled out of the gate, so to speak, and are trying to play catch up. But this definitely is a Toronto friendly trade, I believe. They did yield some picks for Shelton, and again, we'll talk about that more on the side of the New York Sirens. But they weren't really shy, Toronto, Rachel, when it came to dipping and dabbling when it came to picks to potentially just get themselves in a better position in years to come, or to get to a place as was the case with Shelton, and shore up their defense. So we saw another trade, this time with an expansion team, also in the most recent entry draft.
Yeah, so they just made a small picks trade.
Yeah, for sure. And, we'll talk about those picks in just a little bit. But, we talked about Chuli. They picked up in free agency, but they also pick up all from the Montreal Victoire, actually, which is interesting. They
Yeah.
pick up Claire Dalton and Claire DeGeorge. So 2 forwards and a goaltender that come over in free agency. And as you mentioned, still waiting to hear on some of those draft picks, but let's talk about who those picks are. They were pick Emma Gentry with their first pick of the 25 draft. She comes in at 11th overall from St. Cloud State University, so WCHA territory right there. As you mentioned, they were able to focus on forwards. They did pick up Baskin at left D from Minnesota Duluth, but let's start with Gentry because I know it's someone that you've mentioned briefly, and that we'll talk also about when it comes to what this lineup could look like.
Yeah, so with Emma Gentry and then their third overall pick, Claire Van Wiernen from Minnesota Duluth, both of those 2 picks play 1C for their university team. So they're leaders, they're the top of the lineup, and that allows them to rebuild down the middle for Toronto. So I kind of see them as the 2C and the 3C in this upcoming season. Again, there's going to be some competition there, but their other picks are more wingers as far as the forwards. And I think they're going to have a little bit tougher battle, and I'm not sure exactly where they're going to fall in the lineup, but probably in the bottom 6. But if you have Gentry and Van Wiernen as your 2-3C, I think that's solid down the middle, given the experience they have at the university level.
Yeah, 100%. And again, Shelton goes for Toronto's first and fourth pick. That meant that also considering the trade with Vancouver, that they would actually pick twice in the second round. So we talked about Gentry, we talked about Van Wieren, but Kiara Zanon from the Ohio State University, one of those players that maybe can bring in a little bit of versatility for them, a different option, different look when it comes to wingers.
Right. So she was on the second line at the Ohio State University there. I think she and Maggie Connors are going to compete on that left side, and one of them is going to end up on the third line and one will end up on the fourth line. And that'll depend on chemistry and, who wins it out at camp. But I do think Daryl Watts and Emma Maltais are going to lock in those top 2 wing spots on the left side.
Yeah. And so the moves that they made, giving up a first rounder, but then able to, as you said, maybe get some bottom 6, so to speak, depth there to really push and attack in a different way while you're getting your top 6 a little bit of a rest. We'll see how that fares. Okay. We've kind of been talking about it, but just to shore things up here, I think that this third and fourth line is where I want to go here. Emma Woods is an interesting player here because, we've seen Woods in other iterations of women's hockey, play a little bit more of a prominent role, comes over from the Sirens in season 2. Where do you think Woods fits in when it comes to this Toronto lineup going into season 3 of the PWHL?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because I see a sort of similar battle on the right side. And again, it's going to be determined by camp and chemistry and what makes sense in the system that Toronto is putting together. But Claire Dalton, who they picked up in free agency, could get that third line right wing slot. But Emma Woods could be there as well. And she's been there in the past. So I just think it's going to depend on what the team is looking to do and how they want to build those lines and the roles that they want for those particular lines.
Yeah, I still think a player like Woods has a fit, potentially a spot, but it might be situational, to your point and what you're alluding to here, because in women's hockey in particular, when you have a body that is taller than average, that's almost an anomaly. You have players that run on the shorter side in women's hockey, shorter than average, who are very great. We've talked about, Bouye before. But I think just with Woods and her size that she can bring, her physicality that she can bring, when you need someone to step in and play that role, when you're playing a team, maybe like a Minnesota, I think has a pretty strong and tall group of forwards. Maybe it's the matchups and again, how things happen in camp. But I don't know. In women's hockey, I always lean towards, you know, the taller girls. I'm like, yeah, tall girls play hockey too, but and not just goaltender. So okay. Anything else that stands out to you with regard to what this lineup could potentially look like, Rachel, before we give our last thoughts on Toronto and then give some PWHL news?
No, I mean, I think again, the Ella Shelton pickup is great. She'll likely be on that top pairing with Renata Fast. And so I think, you know, Allie Monroe will slot in on the third pairing. We'll see who else will be on that pairing with her, depending on how things turn out in camp. You know, Hannah Baskin's a left defender. She can play on the right, but her better side is on the left. So I don't know if she'll crack the lineup, but I think they're in good shape. It's just, can they put it together and build the
Indeed.
chemistry that they need?
Indeed. I mean, do you have a sense, Rachel, of what needs to go right for Toronto if they want to make a push and find their way to the first Walter Cup final series?
Well, I think their 5-on-5 play has to match their power play, and the power play has to stay where it was last year. And that's a tall order, right?
Mhm.
Because you know, it's easy to think about looking ahead to the playoffs for them, but you got to get there, right? And there's two more teams in the league, and you know, we still don't even know how that is going to work in terms of who makes the playoffs and how with the two additional
Right.
teams, because they haven't really told us yet. So I think that, you know, it's going to be a different kind of regular season. And so they're not going to be able to let up. That's for sure.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, we don't know what the playoffs will look like yet. We don't have a schedule yet, but we do have Barbie merch. So there you go. We did get that announcement earlier on the day that we are recording. Jokes aside, we do have some other news around women's hockey and, of course, the PWHL. Rachel, why don't we start with signings around the league? Boston, Minnesota, and Ottawa getting in on the action.
Yeah, I want to start with Ottawa and signing Emily Clark to a 2-year deal extension, because word on the street is that she got 6 figures in this contract extension. And I believe there are still less than 10 players in the league at this point with 6-figure salaries. And Emily Clark absolutely earned it. And so, you know, stick taps to her. She had 19 points in the 30 games last year. She was obviously a protected player, and kudos to her and her agent for getting that done.
Yeah, I mean, we love to see the women hockey players get paid. So we love that for her. 100% deserves it. Just a solid player here for sure. We move on then to Boston. They
Mm.
they had a few moves that they made, as you noted in our notes. They really were focused on. It seems like maybe with these moves, surefire or protecting for the future, making sure they have a sense and an idea who they expect their core to be.
Yeah, especially with Hillary Knight, who is in a lot of ways, you know, been the face of Boston women's pro hockey for these many years. You know, they wound up protecting Erin Frankel, Alina Mueller, and Megan Keller, which was the right move to make if you're going to let Hillary Knight go, right?
Yeah.
But they still had to sign these players, and they got 2-year deals for all three of them. So I think that really, to your point, locks it down, at least for the next couple of years, and keeps the core together moving forward.
Yes, yes, indeed. Okay, and as I mentioned, Minnesota also gets in on the action. All of these, actually, Rachel, spoiler alert, in case you haven't seen the news, and we're about to tell you, but all of these are 2-year deals. So
Mhm.
again, teams really, I guess, as they're seeing the landscape, what's available, going back and forth in negotiations, making it official and for term with some players. So who did Minnesota guarantee for the next 2 seasons?
So Dominique Petrie signed, and when we talked about the Frost, she was kind of one of the lone question marks left in terms of needing to re-sign. So just to see them wrap that up was good.
Indeed. All right. There was some news around the league. Yes, I have joked about this a few times now, but we know that the Barbie movie was a big deal. We also have seen Barbie cross into into women's ice hockey with players like Sarah Nurse, who we've talked about a lot on this episode since she was playing with the Toronto Sceptres. But fans, early in the morning, we got another crossover with Barbie Mattel. And,
and Tim Hortons for
and
some
Tim
reason.
Hortons. Yes, that's right. In Canada, right, there is that crossover as well, Rachel. Not necessarily, I think, I'm not the target audience here. And even when I was younger, probably also still not the target audience. And I think that you see, like a lot of other brands, that Mattel, the Barbie kind of it means a lot to people, and so I think it's helping to expand women's hockey. So good on them, and you can get merch to match if you so choose. We also, I alluded to this, Rachel, but Hockey Canada actually named, I think it's 92 players overall, but that includes 3 teams: their para team, their women's team, and their men's team. And so we do know that some of the usual suspects for sure were named here when it comes to the women's national team. And this is going to be their road to Italy, because we do have an Olympics coming up at the top of the 2026 year. This is their road to Italy roster. So this is going to be an orientation camp, they're calling it. They're going to do some media. They're going to obviously be on ice. They'll do some internal things. But let's just talk about Toronto, since that's the team we recap. Daryl Watts, Blayre Turnbull, Emma Maltais, Toronto, someone who played for Toronto, plays for Toronto, Natalie Spooner. Then we also have Ella Shelton, who we talked about, Renata Fast, of course. I hope that she's in the I hope I make it air quotes category as far as I'm concerned. So those are the players that, again, have ties to the team that Rachel, we were talking about on today's episode. Any surprises for you here?
I just want to mention they're still trying to make Hannah Miller a thing for Team Canada.
Yes.
Yes. She has not been deemed eligible for any of the last couple of tries. And I also do want to shout out Hockey Canada for announcing all 3 of these introductory rosters at once as a collective Team Canada announcement. To your point, I think that was a really good move by them to put it all out at this at the same time. But I would say there's a lot of usual suspects here, that is for 100%, sure. But
100%. Hannah Miller, it has an asterisk that did not exist the last time we talked about this, because I know we talked about it and I was like, I don't think Hannah Miller is eligible, and you were like, well, I think that they're trying to make her eligible, and then she was on the roster, and then she had to be taken off the roster. So now Hannah Miller on the roster again with an asterisk, but will be I guess we'll see. We have until the end of this month to see how that's going to go. We do know that, Kingsbury, she did re-up with Troy Ryan. Corey Chevery will be an assistant coach along with Carolyn Willette and Brittany Smith. So, I also love that they list all of the staff. I don't think we always get that for USA Hockey or other teams. So they're very inclusive, I think, including para. Now, para hockey is something very interesting. I know, Ann Kimmel is very passionate about adaptive hockey, and para hockey is an Olympic sport. But there's not always pathways for women, especially depending on the country that they are seeking to represent. Women can compete on para teams, but overwhelmingly, para teams that do play and compete in the Olympics are considered effectively men's teams. Anyway, we can talk about that at some other time, but worth mentioning since we're talking about it. Jillian Dempsey retires. You want to talk about a Boston legend actually named the Bruins mascot, which is such a fun story. I always enjoy. But Jillian Dempsey never really could cut her teeth in the PWHL. And this was a league in particular that really was understandably prioritizing the hockey. And we know that Dempsey has had a career as a coach, as a teacher in the classroom. So but someone I always enjoyed watching, that I always enjoyed talking to. So congrats on a great career, Jillian Dempsey. And Rachel, we also have a team that, again, that we'll talk about in a few weeks' time here, but someone new to the staff for the New York Sirens.
Yep, they've added to their assistant coaching group here. And I think, it's going to be an interesting year for them, which we'll get into. But I do think that some changes have to be made, and we'll see if, this staff can put together something different.
Yeah, we'll see if it's enough effectively. I think that, again, we'll talk about this, but I think that the Sirens have had to learn the hard way that you have to make sure you have the right people in place in order to get production. I mean, you have a team that's got the likes of Shelton, who we've talked about, Carpenter, who else is on that, or was Abby Rock, and they just never could really find a foothold. So, a little tough there, but we'll see what Valerie can bring to the table. Definitely has women's hockey experience, which we have talked about and been critical about at a kind of larger conceptual level of when will women get opportunities to coach in women's ice hockey, and what does that look like? What are potentially some of the barriers there? So we're seeing the New York Sirens bring in someone who knows the landscape, and so again, hopefully that will be a step in the right direction. Will it be enough? We'll talk about that on one of our other deep dives for the New York Sirens. We will actually, they're the caboose, if you will, right? Our last entry into this series. But Rachel, we've talked about teams that were in the playoffs, and now it's time to talk about the teams that were on the outside looking in. So who's up next week?
That would be ye old Boston Fleet.
Your favorite city, right?
I have never said I dislike Boston, the city. I love Boston. It's just the sports teams that I've had a long-standing problem with. But, that's the East Coast for you. Rivalries are big.
That's true. They are very, very big. Very, very big. All right. So you know what to do, fans. If you are listening and or watching, let us know in the comments, or you can catch us on TikTok at women's_hockey_report. If you are watching this on the Locked On NHL channel, make sure you go to this video or any of our other videos and leave a comment if you want to talk about Boston, or if you want to tell us a little bit about our Toronto episode. Either way, we want to hear from you. Thank you, as always, for tapping in and being part of our every Saturdayers. I'm going to make that a thing. Fetch didn't work, but every Saturdayers, at least until we have more episodes, Rachel, that's going to be our coin. That's going to be our token, I should say. Our token phrase. Thank you so much for joining us every Saturdayers. We will be back next week with another installment of the Women's Hockey Report. But again, your comments, your feedback, liking the videos, sharing the videos is huge to help us continue to grow a pathway forward where we have even more opportunity to talk about women's hockey. So for Rachel Donner, Erica L Ayala, thanks as always for joining us every Saturday on the Women's Hockey Report. We will catch you on the next episode. Enjoy your Saturday, everyone.